So it has been a really tough time for Tottenham, certainly since the start of November, when they were in third place in the table, and they've kind of fallen away since then. The defence that Thomas Frank is putting up there is that it was a 17th place finish last season, despite the fact that they won the Europa League and qualified for the Champions League through that. Do you think that is how we should measure success for Tottenham, whether they're better than last season in terms of a potential league finish?
No, and that obviously what happened last year wasn't good enough, but what he will say, Ange Postecoglou, is we were prioritising Europe, and they ended up winning a trophy, which for a lot of Spurs fans was an important thing for them, because of how much criticism they had in the past. So that was a real anomaly, if you like. But to be where they are right now, 14 for this stage of the season, isn't good enough. They won two games at home against Brentford and Burnley. The form hasn't been good enough, and you can turn around, and his argument is a little bit like, well, it's hard to, with competing in Champions League when you're in it and then trying to get into the Champions League. If you look at those seasons, especially, under Pochettino, second and third, that was phenomenal. And the following year, third, fourth again. That was real consistency. And that's what you're trying to achieve if you're Tottenham. And that's what the Spurs fans expect. That's what they demand. And rightly so. And it has been difficult. The squad, I suppose, Thomas Frank would say, well, I need a little bit more. And I do believe he needs time. When you turn around and say, well, we were really, really poor against Arsenal, but then we did well against PSG. That's not going to wash with the Spurs fans. They want to do really well against Arsenal. If they don't do well against PSG, that's fine. Chelsea at home, not been good enough. And I think that's where you create, if you like, that belief between the manager and the fans and the players by your home form. And that has to improve, because that hasn't been good enough by any stretch of the imagination. And Thomas Frank has to accept that.
Alan, what about that point about Champions League football being harder to achieve through the league when you're trying to compete in the Champions League at the same time? And particularly, he would say, because they didn't qualify for the Champions League through the league. This wasn't a squad that was regularly performing at Champions League level.
Well, firstly, let's go back to that graph. They wouldn't have finished 17th because Ange definitely kicked in. They would have finished somewhere halfway from that, I think, if he'd played the front team all the time. But he was concentrating on Europe, and hence they're really low position. But, where they are now is difficult to kind of really add up about exactly what they are, Spurs. Sometimes I look at them and wonder what team they are. Are they a low-block team that are going to counter-attack? Are they going to dominate games? And I think a problem Thomas Frank has had, really, is home form. And the home form is when you've got to dictate the game. And this isn't a natural for Thomas Frank's teams. At Brentford, they were always set up to counter-attack. So I think that adjustment's been a bit of a problem. When you go back to the Europe question, which you asked me, that is significant. Because if your squad's not deep enough, when we finished fifth at Newcastle, we went into Europe and had a really difficult league campaign. We just couldn't do back-to-back games. And ironically, this afternoon, we're coming to Crystal Palace, who have played 30 games this season because of Europe. And they're really finding it difficult now, starting to lose players, injuries, lack of energy. So I think that is a questionable thing that he's said there. I think there's some relevance to it, that to be a Champions League team next year will be difficult for them. I think it's all kind of papering over the crack. He's good with the media, Thomas Frank. He's a good talker. But I do actually think they're underperforming, even with a squad that I think is poor for a team of Spurs' finance and standing. And I think that's where Tottenham fans are. They're a little bit kind of, come on then, we want a bit more from the manager.
And because of what you've said, he would argue that this is showing signs of progress in the way that he explained to Pat there. But do you think he's been surprised by how much is expected of him at Tottenham? Yeah,
because when you lose a game, if I lose a game at Crystal Palace or I lose a game at Charlton or he lost a game at Brentford, that's not the same as losing a big derby game like he did to Arsenal, where they didn't play Jamie, did they? They didn't really turn up.
In every aspect.
And that doesn't get forgotten. When I lost to Sunderland 3-0 at home to Newcastle, every time I lost, that game got a mention every time. You never turn up even for the derby. So it's always there, that one. It's always going to come back to haunt him a little bit. His home form is a massive problem for any big club. But at Spurs at the moment, particularly on the back of last year, where their form was rubbish as well, their record in this calendar year is awful at home. So the fans are suffering. They want to see a bit. Luckily, on the away trips, they've been quite good. You know, I think they've won 5 away from home this year. So, you know, it'd be interesting to see how they play today at Crystal Palace.
I think as well, in defence, he hasn't got 2 of his better players going forward, and that's been major problems for them, I think, especially at home. You know, no Solanke, no Kulusevski, and Maddison as well. I think you could add into that. I think in terms of you want creativity, you need goals. And to not have those 3 players has been a miss. You know, I've not been good enough from Brennan Johnson, not been good enough from Richarlison. Colin Moani hasn't really hit the ground running. So I think in terms of getting those players back, but also recruitment, I don't think the recruitment has been good enough at times. You know, when Eze came around, you know, make sure you sign him. He's such an important player. He could have been a game changer for you. Obviously, Javi Simmons comes in. He's done okay at a couple of moments, but in big games, has he affected it? Not yet. So I do think he still needs time. And I think we need to give him that. It doesn't always happen in terms of, you know, certainly at big clubs. But if he gets given time and he gets the right players in and the right players fit, I'm sure he can still be a success there.